In this video, we're going to talk about how to taste beer critically. We are going to end with the wisdom. This is a video about how to taste beer. It's not a video about how to drink beer, because drinking beer should be easy. And when you're drinking beer, frankly, you shouldn't be thinking too much about it. You should simply be enjoying it because you know that it's a beer that you love. So to taste beer, this is something that we do at Treehouse all day, every day. And not only beer, we taste things. We taste grain, we taste the wort, which is the beer in process. We taste the beer before it's dry hopped. We taste the beer after it's dry hopped. We taste it before it's packaged, and then we taste it always after it's packaged, and we continue to taste it to see how it develops within the can over the course of its life. So in terms of my background, I don't have a formal Cicerone or other beer-related certification for tasting or judging beer. I just want to make that clear up front. All of my knowledge comes from the School of Hard Knocks. I've been a brewer for over a decade, and in that time I've personally brewed thousands of batches of beer that required my taste every step of the way. And I've also developed hundreds of beer recipes that enable me to understand what a beer should taste like. One of the most important things about tasting beer is to make sure that you have a clean palate. For me, I get frustrated if someone provides feedback that a stout was not sweet enough or too sweet, or if an IPA was too bitter when I know that it wasn't. If you have sweetness on your palate, if you eat a handful of dried mangoes and then you take a sip of Julius, naturally it is going to be perceived as less sweet. So if you're tasting beer critically, be really careful not to have anything else on your palate. Developing your palate for tasting is one of the most important things that you can do, both as a brewer or a consumer. As a brewer, if you can't taste off flavors and you don't properly assess your beer, it's really, really hard to improve it. And as a consumer, it's just fun to understand what represents good and what represents not so good, so you can refine your own palate and truly seek out what you and you alone enjoy without outside influences. So for the purposes of this exercise, I've chosen a new Treehouse beer. This one happens to be called Kiora. Those of you who are fans of Treehouse and the channel would know that we are enormous fans of New Zealand and what it has done for the brewing world in terms of their hops and their passion for the industry. This particular beer contains the very first New Zealand grown malt that's been imported into the United States. The reason I have chosen this beer is because I want to look at it with a very critical eye. We are using new ingredients, and throughout the brewing process, we will be all over the different types of characteristics that this new to us grain would impart. Whereas a beer like Julius, I've tasted it thousands of times. I definitely know what to expect. However, that said, every time we brew Julius and taste Julius, we are looking at it critically and trying to see where we can improve it, still almost 15 years after its original creation. As soon as I crack the beer open, I'm wondering, what does it look like? How is the can filled? Do I have a creamy foam that's coming out of the top of the can when I crack it? The answer is yes. Generally, I'll form my first impression by sticking my nose right in here, but that's not necessarily the best way to do it. Choosing your glassware is really important. I would suggest any glass shaped like a wine glass. You want a top that is smaller than the bulb below it, which will enable you to both swirl the beer and funnel that flavor and aroma directly to your nose. So again, for tasting purposes, I'm not going to fill the glass all the way to the brim, and I'll explain why in just a second. Now, when I think about tasting beer, I generally think about 4 to 5 attributes. I think about aroma, taste, texture, appearance, and then overall impression. So the very first thing I'm going to look at is the appearance. What does this beer look like? For a Treehouse style hazy pale ale, we're going to look for bright, vibrant yellow. One of the things that I call it like the dirty dish soap appearance, where the actual color is not uniform. For me, if I see that in any one of our beers, Houston, we have a huge problem. So I'm looking for uniformity of transparency, uniformity of color. I'm looking for whether or not the shade of yellow that the beer is matches what we expected from the recipe. All around, I'm looking at the head retention. I'm looking at what the foam looks like on top of the beer. One of the worst things you can see on top of a hoppy beer is a big bubble. Oftentimes for me, even visually, I can tell if a beer is going to be astringent just by looking at it, because the more overhopped a beer is, the weirder the head retention becomes. So looking at this guy, Michael, I'm not sure if you can get in there, but this creamy foam kind of sticks to the side of the glass, and then the foam skim that's residing on top of the beer is especially beautiful. So those are the things that I'm looking for. Does the color look good? Does the color look uniform? Is the haze level meeting our expectations? And does the skim of foam retain itself and have that really creamy, tight bubble appearance? Those are all things that indicate a really solid process and a really thoughtful brewing execution. Aroma. Always give it a gentle swirl and get right in there. One thing that I like to do, when you breathe in through your nose, you actually alternate which nostril you're breathing in through. So some of the time you're breathing in through your left side, and it will switch, your autonomic nervous system will switch from one side to the other every couple of hours for reasons I'm not sure that we understand. So when you're getting your nose in there to smell the beer, go to your right side and go to your left side. You'd be surprised, depending on which nostril you're breathing through in that moment, you will actually have a slightly different experience. So in on the right, in on the left. And the last thing I want to mention in terms of the aromatic qualities of beer, if you're tasting and not drinking, is you want to cover the glass with your hand, swirl it, get your nose right down to it, and then get in there. That will really concentrate those aromas. It will off-gas them into the bulb. They'll be residing in the air within the glass, and then you get right in there. It really, really concentrates that aroma. In terms of what we're looking for when we're smelling the beer, first and foremost, as you've heard me talk about on the channel before, oftentimes a great beer is the absence of any negative attributes within this beer. So for those of you who brew at home, you're familiar with certain off characteristics. You'd be looking for dimethyl sulfide, which could be a flaw that's created on the hot side if you don't boil for long enough in the kettle. You could get some acetaldehyde or some isoamyl acetate flavors. Acetaldehyde is appley, whereas isoamyl acetate is more like banana ester. But there's a whole list of things that you could be looking for in the aroma alone that you can troubleshoot where you might have gone wrong with the brew. For example, like I mentioned, the dimethyl sulfide could be a flaw with your brewing process on the hot side. But I'll leave it to others to explain exactly how to troubleshoot what those off flavors and aromas are. It's actually been hard to be talking about smelling this beer for the last minute and a half without taking a sip of it. Before I do, aromatically, I'm getting a ton of bright citrus on this beer. I'm getting a really interesting malt quality that's coming across as bready to me. And honestly, all things considered, it's really hard to find flaw in the way that this beer smells. Bright citrus, there's no residual yeast character. There's a really nice bready note from that New Zealand malt. And all things considered, it smells great. Moving on to taste. Taste will differ in aroma in several really important ways. Primarily in the taste, you're looking for what the flavor profile is. Is it sweet? Is it balanced? Does it have a lot of bitterness? Is it astringent on your palate? Is it phenolic? There's a lot of ways that tasting will actually distinguish itself from aroma, whereas there will be many qualities that are similar. So if you smell citrus on the nose, there's a good chance you may also taste citrus. But again, bitterness you can't necessarily smell until you get the beer on your palate. So for me, when I'm tasting, a sip goes in and it just sits on the tongue. Don't drink it. We're not drinking beer, we're tasting. So bring it in. I'll almost form a cup on my tongue and just kind of let the beer sit there for a second, let it really linger on the palate, and then ask myself, am I feeling the sensations that I enjoy? Is it gently carbonated? Is it soft? Does it have the appropriate bitterness? Is there the right balance of sweet and bitterness? Am I tasting anything astringent? Astringency is like, if you can imagine, it's kind of an unpleasant connotation, but if you suck on a tea bag, it really leaves that drying characteristic on your tongue that's very unpleasant. Oftentimes it won't appear until after you've swallowed the beer, and it kind of hangs out, and it's a very unpleasant attribute that could be a function of over-sparging, it could be a function of over-hopping, it could be a function of over-dry hopping or lack of conditioning, but there's certainly many ways to troubleshoot that characteristic, but what's really important is you understand what it is and why you're looking for it. So Kiora, yeah, we should have picked a beer that had some flaws. This guy is really bright citrus. It has a really firm bitterness to it. It has that really nice thiol-centric New Zealand character. There's Sauvignon Blanc here. There's a little bit of grassy bitterness that's going on, but it's really pleasant on the finish and entices my next sip. Again, letting that beer sit on your tongue, is it pleasant? Am I having a good time? Is one of the most important attributes to tasting. When you taste, swallowing right away is not the thing to do. You want to let the beer linger on your palate as you form your impression, and you think about ways to consider that beer the next time that you brew it and potentially improve upon it. All right, so last thing before talking about the overall impression of this beer, what is the texture of this beer like? And you know, all things being equal, to me, texture is one of the things that with Treehouse I'm the most proud of, and it's one of the things that can really amplify your beer at home if you pay attention to it. Texture can only be discerned on the palate, so once again, we take a sip. Let it linger on the palate. Does it fill your mouth up when you take a sip of it? Is it soft? If the beer is overcarbonated, or if it's carbonated in a way that produces big bubbles, it'll taste seltzer-like and very unpleasant on your palate. The richness and fullness of the beer itself prior to carbonation will lend itself to a creaminess and softness within this beer, but I often use the word supple. You want to look for a proper carbonation that leaves a little bit of bubbles on the tongue, but it's very soft and then quickly kind of disappears and entices the next sip. That is what you are looking for when you think about texture inside of your beer. All right, so overall impression of a beer. For me, I think about that on a kind of overarching theme. Outside of tasting and combining all these things with a critical eye, the overall impression scale is kind of, when I drink this beer, do I like it? And that to me is the purest form of tasting a beer. And you know, if your overall impression of a beer is negative, you have a lot of work to do. Hopefully all of your beers, the overall impression is pretty good, but you know, combining the aroma, texture, flavor, appearance, and kind of iterating on those to make them a little bit better will lift that overall impression from above average to truly great. For me, you know, I have to be totally honest, the overall impression of this beer also has to do with the story of its origin, how much effort the Treehouse team put into it, years of thought and execution into how to make a pale ale like this combined with thoughtful ingredient sourcing, to me makes a beer that's incredibly pleasant to enjoy, and it gives me a high overall impression. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but learning how to taste beer both critically and with knowledge actually takes a ton of work and insight. There's no shortcuts in terms of learning what you should expect from a beer. So I would really encourage you to learn more on your own, get yourself an off flavor kit. Please follow the tips in this video and look at your beer with a critical eye. All great brewers think their best batch of beer is potentially, just a stepping stone to their next best batch of beer. And the only way you can get there is to look at things with a critical eye. So be hard on yourself, not too hard. Relax, don't worry, and have a home brew. And thanks for watching. We'll catch you guys next time.